Good morning, everyone. It is 8:30, so we'll go ahead and get started because I know Dr. Johnson has a lot of great information to share with us. Hello and welcome to day 2 of the Patent Literacy Symposium and Dr. Johnson's session, Distinguishing Between Difference, Disorder, and Advantage, Cultural Considerations for Diverse Readers. My name is Jenny Alexandria. I'm going to be facilitating along with Jeannie Hertzler today. And I just have a couple of housekeeping announcements that you probably heard yesterday, but if in case you weren't here yesterday, I will repeat them. Again, the link is in, yes, we will put the document link in there again. The link that we'll be putting in there is for the session notes, for Dr. Johnson's bio, a lot of great information there. So you can access the link that was just put in the chat. Just as a reminder, this session will be recorded and it's 75 minutes in length, but that includes a 15-minute question and answer period at the end. If you need to access closed captioning, just click on the icon on the Zoom control panel, CC Live Transcript. And if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please go to the technical support guides, which are above the schedule on the symposium page. So again, please keep your video feature off and stay muted so that there's no potential distractions during the presentation. And if you would like to tweet, if anybody's doing that, the hashtag for the symposium is hashtag patent LIT 2022. So hashtag patent lit 2022. And now I would like to hand this over to Dr. Lakeisha Johnson.
Thank you so much, Jenny. It's a pleasure to be with you all, especially at 8:30 in the morning. And yes, do tweet about it. I think I have my Twitter handle and things at the end of the slide, so you can check it out. But I'd love to hear your thoughts and your feedback as we go through the presentation. And so I'm excited to have you all join so early in the morning. And we're going to get started. So we'll be talking about distinguishing between difference, disorder, and disadvantage. I tend to call these the 3 Ds. So just for my disclosures, I am faculty at Florida State University, the author of the DAWS program, which is a dialect awareness program we'll talk about a little bit later, and the founder of a website, Maya's Book Nook, along with an honorarium, excuse me, for this presentation. And I don't have any non-financial disclosures. So in terms of the outcomes, what will you be able to take away from this discussion today? You will be able to talk about African American English and how it's differentiated from mainstream American English or academic English. We'll also talk about oral language skills and the connections between oral language and literacy outcomes in African American students. And then we'll discuss some assessment and treatment practices that are culturally responsive. As she mentioned, if you have questions throughout the presentation, please do go ahead and throw them in the chat. I'll be watching those, but Jenny and Jeannie will also be helping me to make sure I address all questions so I can answer them throughout, as well as in our 15-minute block at the end. And so one of my favorite quotes came from an open letter that was written by the Oakland NAACP. And I like to often start with this quote because it really sets the framework for our discussion. Freedom without literacy is like being in a rowboat without paddles. It's so important that we think about literacy as not just, this thing that, kids come to school, they learn how to read, they go out and they be successful and amazing. We have to also think about literacy as a social justice issue, especially as we know that there are so many children from lots of communities all over our country who are struggling readers. And so I want to start us off with just some core principles for defining literacy, which comes from Keith and Copeland. And it really lays the framework for this mindset shift around who can be literate. So the first is that we have to believe as researchers, as practitioners, as literacy coaches, educators, special educators, we have to believe that all are capable of acquiring some form of literacy. It is important, and especially with my background as a speech language pathologist, I'm often thinking about this through the lens of our students with disabilities, students who are at risk for disabilities. We have to have expectations that all children, no matter what they come to school with, are capable of acquiring literacy. We also know and have to be guided by another principle that literacy is a fundamental human right. It is a fundamental part of the human experience. We also know that literacy is a collective responsibility. This is not just the role of the one parent, the one teacher, the one school system. It is a community effort. It is a collective responsibility because we know in terms of what happens and the connections between literacy levels in school and then later outcomes later in life. Literacy also has the potential to lead to empowerment, right? It can be freeing. The more you read, the more you know about so many different things. And so it's empowering, but then also literacy requires and creates a connection with others. So it is another mode of communication. And so my expertise area is related to African-American students and dialect usage and how this then impacts language and literacy outcomes. So we'll start off just by having some framework, and this may be some information that you know, so I won't spend too much time here, but to provide you with a little bit of foundational background knowledge. Non-mainstream dialects, those are any of the dialects that differ systematically from mainstream American English, which of course is the language that's used in media and in more formal situations. And they can also vary based on socio-demographic variables, things like age, race, SES, region, right? Those are all many different ways that languages and dialects can vary. And so hopefully at this point, you are fully aware if I were to ask the question, do you speak a dialect? Hopefully everybody would raise their hand, nod to themselves and say, yes, you do. We all speak a dialect, of course. Mainstream American English itself is a dialect of British English, right? So mainstream English is broadly defined as the language used in media and presumably by school teachers. We'll talk a little bit about that later. You've also probably heard it called General American English, Academic English, Standard American English. It has several different names. So my expertise area, as I mentioned, is African American English, or AAE. And so it has been studied extensively in the context of both language disorders and literacy achievement. And that focus has often been on children from low income backgrounds. And so AAE is differentiated in all of the language domains, but mostly where we see a lot of these characteristics and features are in phonology and morphology. So in sounds and in morphemes, those affixes, the affixes, prefixes, and suffixes. AAE also overlaps with other non-mainstream dialects. And so depending on what part of the country you are in, there are other non-mainstream dialects, but AAE in particular overlaps with Southern White English, Gullah Geechee, Hispanic influenced English, and a few others. And so it has been long regarded as a low prestige dialect, and it has been heavily stigmatized in academic and in mainstream social contexts. But one of the things that's important for us to know is that African American English itself is a systematic linguistic or rule-governed linguistic system, right? And we know that a lot of sociolinguistics and a lot of the research that has been done by linguists have told us that the stigmatization of AAE has more so been largely based on adverse stereotypes of the people who speak the language and not necessarily the language system itself. And so the earliest accounts of it were characterized as a dialect that was broken, it was simplified, but we know that that is not the case. It can be very complex, it's sophisticated. There are certain things that you wouldn't do in African American English simply because it doesn't follow the rules. And so dialect use varies along a continuum from low to high. And so the rate at which speakers produce dialect features, we call that dialect density. And so when you think about maybe a student perhaps that you're working with and you're curious as to whether or not they're a dialect speaker, you may see that there is some amount where you have some kids that may speak a lot of dialect, and you may have some that speak a lower density or a lower amount of dialect, lower frequency. The other way that we sometimes talk about dialect usage is this term called linguistic distance. And so linguistic distance is how far or how different one's speech is from the standard. So think back to what we said on the last slide around mainstream American English or academic English, if that's the quote unquote standard, right? In the US, when we think about what's happening in our educational system in terms of grammar and ELA, what's taught in classrooms, and which next gets kids to attaining literacy skills, mainstream American English is considered that standard or point of reference. Linguistic distance, though, is we know that AAE is not that far from mainstream American English, mostly because it is a dialect of mainstream American English. It is not a whole nother language to where you wouldn't understand semantically the meaning of what someone's saying. Maybe there are just some differences in phonology and morphology, as I've stated. And so this concept of linguistic distance is really important because people like me, professionals like me as SLPs, you often attempt to measure the magnitude of linguistic distance when determining whether a child has a language disorder. But we can also think about that when we think about children who may have reading disabilities or children who are struggling readers, right? And then there's also this concept of standardized language ideology, this fact around that there is this one way that we are supposed to be able to communicate and talk, right? And so that can be especially problematic for a child who may be starting school when then they hear that the language system that they bring with them is stigmatized, it's negative, it's considered broken. It's this whole ideology that we have to use this academic English, right? And so what we also know in terms of the research, SES has been a consistent predictor of dialect density. So SES has a relationship with how much dialect is often used. And we also know that it's not just African Americans who speak African American English. If there are people from other backgrounds who are growing up in those environments and communities, they may also be speakers of African American English. There's also some really fascinating work being done by other colleagues around children who are Spanish speakers picking up, who are native or native Spanish speakers who are picking up AAE as their second language. So it's really, really fascinating work coming out around these language systems. So SES is a consistent predictor of dialect density, but we know that that can be problematic. And you're probably thinking, what's the issue? Why do, you know, what's the problem? This is a problem because language weaknesses that are also associated with economic disadvantage, there's that other D, can present very similarly to the linguistic features of AAE. And so all of these things may often overlap with some of those clinical indicators. And so as we're kind of thinking, and you can feel free, you know, to just put these things in the chat, do you feel you speak a dialect? Do all African Americans speak AAE? These are just some questions that probably at this point in our first 10 minutes or so together, you should have the answers to. If you're interested, for example, in learning more about African American English and other non-mainstream dialects and languages, you can take a look at the phonemic inventories that is on the American Speech Language and Hearing Association's website, which I'll show you just really quickly. It goes and has different phonemic inventories and linguistic information for different languages. And so it's a really amazing reference that can be really impactful for those who may be working with children from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. For example, here in Tallahassee, very recently, there's been a large immigrant population from the Congo. And so they speak Congolese. And these children are all in one specific neighborhood, which means they all go to the same school. And very early on, we had some questions around how do we help these students, right? I don't speak Congolese. I can't help you with that part, but what I can do is learn about these phonemic inventories, right? What are the, learn more about the language system, and then some of those best practices for working with children from different backgrounds, which we'll get to in a little bit later. So now we're going to talk specifically about African-American students and literacy skills. And so, of course, for the role of SLPs, we have a huge responsibility regarding literacy, whether that's not just preventing written language problems by fostering language acquisition and emergent literacy skills. We also are involved in the identification, assessment, providing intervention, as well as advocating for effective literacy practices. So for those of you, of course, who have been working, in schools where you maybe are a part of the MTSS team, or you are, the reading specialist, the literacy coach, I do hope you have your SLP involved in terms of thinking through reading interventions because of our unique training around oral language. And of course, oral language is foundational for literacy. It's important to have those varied perspectives. One of the things that I've seen in the comments around African-American English and being able to switch back and forth, it's really, really cool when we see just how impactful language is. And so children, I've seen this even in my own child. I have a 6-year-old. And although, the term typically that you hear is code switching, you are able to go back and forth between AAE or whichever dialect and mainstream American English or academic English. Very often when I'm at home, I'm using AAE, or, it's some of those things I may be going back and forth, just like you hear in this presentation. But I heard my daughter use a double negative, which is something that I don't typically do, but I heard her use the double negative for the first time. And I was like, oh my gosh, it is amazing how ingrained these language systems are within us without even hearing some of these models at home, right? But it's also important, of course, that children are able to have the understand that these dialects and language systems are valuable and they're cultural. They're important in terms of your culture. So when we think about literacy in the United States, what we know is that only 18% of African-American fourth graders are reading at or above grade level expectations, compared to the 45% of white students. We know this based on NAEP data, and we know that there has been little narrowing of this Black-white achievement gap, right, that we have been discussing for quite some time. And so there's even been a significant decline in NAEP scores from 2017 to 2019. But most importantly to note is that this decline was seen significantly in our lowest performers, those students from students of color, students who are from impoverished backgrounds. It is absolutely staggering that 79% of fourth graders eligible for free and reduced lunch did not meet reading proficiency. I don't even have on this slide information about children with disabilities, right? The numbers are even lower around reading proficiency. While the advances around the science of reading have been very vast and it has been extensive, especially around looking at how children learn how to read, looking at children who are struggling readers, how the brain works, how we learn how to do these things. What we know is that many African American children still struggle. The important part to keep in mind when you see these kinds of numbers, and it'll be really interesting to see what the next set of NAEP scores, show us, with what declines or maybe losses or gains in some situations that may be seen over and beyond this COVID period. It'll be very interesting to see, but we know that for Black students in the US in particular, these factors around reading performance aren't just due to what's happening in the classroom. There are structural conditions both inside and outside of school that can contribute to additional risk, right? And so insufficient and inadequate school resources, instructional quality. How high quality is it, right? We know what we should be doing. The research has told us, right? And is there also concentrated neighborhood poverty, political strife, school segregation and resegregation, right? These are all things that can impact how a child is learning how to read and how successful they are. Hence why this really does get back to being a social justice issue. I literally went to a school just 2 days ago where it is a majority African-American school and less than 13% of their students, their third graders, are reading at proficiency or at or above proficiency. We know that that is a huge problem, right? And so the other things in terms of research, it's shown us that AAE use has been associated with many different literacy skills, decoding, phonological awareness, spelling, comprehension, even composition and writing. There's this moderate and inverse relationship between the frequency of oral dialect usage and reading and writing outcomes. And this is even larger for students with language and reading impairments, or students with disabilities, right? What we've seen often is that the more dialect a student uses in his or her spoken or written language, the lower their literacy scores tend to be. But that's not where it stops, right? So very often people will read that part of the research article and see that there is this moderate and negative inverse relationship between dialect use, or AAE in particular, and these literacy skills. That's not where we need to stop though, because it is not just this one thing that is ensuring that students aren't learning how to read. Despite these compounding kind of vulnerabilities, these risks, we know that African-American students in particular can meet grade level expectations using systematic and explicit instruction, using evidence from the science of reading. One of the things that I like to talk about is how it is also important to use culturally responsive strategies when thinking about teaching reading skills to students from diverse backgrounds, because it can be extremely beneficial when thinking about it through the lens of valuing the dialects that they're bringing to the table. And so this came from a paper that was written with one of my mentors, Dr. Nicole Patton-Terry, myself, and another colleague, Dr. Brandy Gatlin-Nash. In and of itself, using dialect does not cause literacy deficits, right? In and of itself, if you have no other takeaway from this presentation, keep in mind that just because you use a dialect, it does not cause a literacy deficit. Just because you are bilingual, it does not cause a literacy deficit. And we can insert all of these other dialects into this, right? It's not just the dialect. And so we've been learning a lot from the bilingual literature. And even very often, I myself, I'll go back and forth. I'll use some dialect in presentations just like this because I think that it's important. I even do it in the classes that I'm teaching with undergraduate and master's students who will be the future generation of speech and language pathologists. I think it's really important that we see people who are in these positions, reading researchers like myself, people who have all these letters behind their name. We have to take the stigma away from some of these dialects that have been so heavily stigmatized as being broken and negative and being less than, in order to empower students who may be speakers of them. You can't cringe when you hear me say ain't, or if I drop a G off of the ing, right? The present progressive ing. If that's cringeworthy to you, what does it mean when you're working with a student of color who's using this as a dialect? And this is simply a part of the language system, right? So these 3Ds: disorder, difference, disadvantage. This is in, this Venn diagram comes from a book chapter that just came out this year with Dr. Ryan James and myself, where we talk about these interactions between these things. So far we've talked about, we've hit on each one, and you may start to see how there are some of these overlaps, because as I said, AAE has often been studied in the context of language disorders and literacy achievement, focused on children from low-income backgrounds. So when we think about this, you know, there's often these things around language disorders and SES disadvantage. Let's start there. We know that there are some overlaps, right? What do we see happen with a child that may be coming from a background where they may not have access to lots of high quality books? You know, maybe there weren't lots of conversations happening in the home that were language rich, right? And thank you all. Keep the comments coming in the chat, right? But I think it's important when we think about the connections between these two things, we know that there's this overlap, right? And so often, even as a professor, I used to do it. I used to talk about dialect and disorder like it was this dichotomy: dialect versus disorder, dialect versus disorder. And that is true, but it is not that black or white, right? We also know that there are students who speak dialect who also have a language disorder. There can be disorder within dialect. And so there's this unintended consequence where, you know, we have this goal of teasing apart whether a student is a dialect speaker or if they have a language disorder. Is one or the other. And that's not always the case, because there are these interactions with other things like poverty, right? And so we can think about it: disorder and language disorder and SES disadvantage. We know that one thing in particular that can be an overlap, if we were filling in our Venn diagram with some overlap keys, we could put vocabulary right there, right? We could also, in this section between dialect and disadvantage, remember I said that there's all this research that shows that based on SES, there are these relationships around how much dialect you use, right? So there are relationships between SES and dialect density. The other part that we're going to get into a lot more in depth is the overlaps that are between difference and disorder. I'm going to show you some actual characteristics of African American English that are also, when we think about what happens in terms of language disorders or children who may be at risk for language disorders, there are very similar things that they do. And so you do have to kind of tease apart, where do you go next? And so if you have not ever taken a look at the NAEP assessment data, click the link in the handouts, go look at the 4th grade reading reports for your respective states or areas. Does this reflect the students and families that you're working with? And then where do we go from here, right? So I'm gonna now, of course, because I like to end these presentations, not just give you all this info around, okay, here's the problem, right? Here are all the things that are wrong with what we're doing around, all the things that are wrong around how kids are learning how to read. That's not what we're gonna do. We're also gonna talk about some clinical implications, specifically for assessment as well as for intervention. And these are going to be some things, whether you are a speech language pathologist, a literacy coach, a general education teacher, ESE teacher, anyone who's working with kids, you're going to be able to start to think through how you do some of these things. So of course, we know that standardized assessments are, the gold standard for ensuring that we're able to identify students as having different types of impairments, whether that's a reading disability, a language disability. We have that information that we have to gather. But we also know that there are lots of cultural and linguistic biases that have been found on many of these assessments. And there's lots of research to back that up, right? So it's crucial that we are able to identify students who have developmental language disorders early and accurately, because there are these connections between children who have language impairments and how that then impacts later reading skills. And so some alternative methods may be necessary to determine whether there is language disorder within the context of AAE use, as well as socioeconomic disadvantage. So we're going to go through each one of these. So the first, of course, is language sample analysis. This is just that process of really trying to listen, observe, talking through the child in a more naturalistic conversation, or that is not just let's turn the pages of this test, point to something, or give a response out loud, right? You want to be able to look at just how the child is using language, and whether you do that in a conversation, whether you have a more kind of scripted kind of a thing where you're gonna say, hey, we're gonna pretend that we're at a restaurant, I'm the waitress, you're the customer, whether it's a narrative with a story retell or a picture description. Language samples can be really important for identifying whether or not there's a child who may be at risk for a language disorder, and then how that then can impact some of these other areas of literacy, right? And so language samples, while you may not do this for everybody at your school, clearly, you don't have time for that, right? I would never suggest you give everybody a language sample. But for some of those students who you may be concerned, whether you're trying to figure out what's really happening here, do I need to be aware of some cultural and linguistic differences? It is a way to add more information to some of your standardized assessments. We also know that language samples provide a wealth of information. You can get things about all domains of language, and you can look at what they know about story grammar. You can look at vocabulary, so many different things. All of these alternative assessment techniques have been shown to be least or less biased towards students of color, students growing up in poverty. Dynamic assessment. Think about this just like what you're doing with your MTSS and RTI teams, right? It is this idea that we're going to combine both assessment and treatment. We're taking data points, and then we're allowing a child to be taught, right? I have a colleague who recently in a presentation said we have to learn to teach before we treat. Teach before we treat. How often do we think about all the things that a child can't do and then throw them into these super intensive interventions before even providing that high quality foundational tier 1 teaching, instead of hopping directly into these super intensive interventions? Oh, they need reading mastery, they need corrective, they need all these things, right? That's not where we need to be. We have to ensure that we are looking at both independent and assisted performance. And that's really the test, teach, retest model is really what we can also see on a larger scale with what we do in terms of MTSS, right? We also know that what we've seen in terms of research, speakers who are using African-American English, they're going to show more modifiability in terms of a dynamic assessment model rather than those who have true language deficits. So it's important to know that given that little bit of assistance, right, that can be helpful. Whereas a child who actually does have a language disorder or deficit, they're going to need much more. Processing dependent tasks are often recommended for speakers or children from CLD backgrounds because you rule out needing to know all this stuff around prior knowledge, right? We have to stop believing that what children come to school with, if their experiences don't look exactly like this theoretical world where the family read to them every single night, they had these rich conversations where they were always doing expansions and extensions, that they aren't bringing things to the table, right? Or they go to museums on weekends. Families are doing the best they can with what they can, right? And their kids are still coming to school with some valuable experiences. It may just not look like the experiences that you've seen in the past that map on really well to what helps them to be successful. So processing dependent tasks can be impactful because they don't depend on that prior knowledge. Contrastive analysis is another method that can often be used when thinking about whether or not this is a dialect speaker. And you can look at this even when thinking about having a child read some sentences out loud, right? If we're connecting this back to literacy. Remember, we talked about dialect density being the number of dialect features used, and you almost get a ratio. So you divide the number of features by the total number of words. And contrastive analysis will then allow you to systematically study a pair of languages to identify their structural differences and similarities. This is building meta-linguistic awareness, right? And this is something that's going to be impactful and helpful for all students, not just African-American students or students who speak AAE, right? So we want to be able to have all of our children and our students be able to think about language in this really rich way. Some of the ways that can be helpful for you all as practitioners, when you are even thinking about assessments, right? Think about this differences between dialect sensitive kinds of features and dialect neutral features. Dialect sensitive features are those that can be produced differently in AAE and MAE, right? And I'm going to show you this on the next slide. Whereas dialect neutral features are produced the same in both AAE and MAE. So let's say, for example, you're really trying to figure out, is this student a dialect speaker? I'm not really sure what's happening, or maybe even when I'm having them read some things, like if it is an assessment like where they have to read a phrase out loud and you're seeing if they are repeating it, like a sentence repetition task, right? On some of our assessments, you'll see those. These dialect sensitive features are things that can be produced differently in both MAE and AAE. And so when you add these types of grammatical features and phonological features, you may see some differences in how students perform, students who are African-American English speakers. So you may see, sometimes they may use that plural, other times they may not, right? You may see a possessive sometimes. Sometimes it may not be there, right? Subject-verb agreement. These are all things that are contrastive. It means in MAE, I'm going to do these things differently than what I would in AAE. And you'll also see those like G dropping, when people think AAE, they very often come into some of these phonological kinds of things, G dropping, substitution of TD, F, or V for voiceless TH sound, right? So instead of bath, this, right? Those are some of the ones that often kind of stick out as some of those features. But when we're thinking about it, our assessments give AAE speakers many opportunities on a regular basis, right? To be able to do these things variably. And so what I recommend often is when thinking about whether or not that you want to do something that values all these different that values these linguistic differences, think about the dialect neutral things. These are the things that I don't care what dialect you're using, we just not doing that. We don't just drop articles, right? We're keeping our A's and thes. That is not an AAE thing. That's not an MAE thing. So there are certain grammatical features in the English language that are dialect neutral. That means that it's not an MAE, it's not an AAE either, right? We're using our prepositions in, on, those, in, on, with, down, right? Even some of these consonant digraphs. So these are just some tables to kind of help you think about that. There's a question in the chat about some of the most respectful manners to help students with MAE and honor their AAE. I'm going to get to that in just a few slides. And it's perfect timing that you asked, because now that we've determined that the child is a speaker of AAE and does actually have a language disorder, because for me as an SLP, I don't treat students who have language who are AAE speakers, right? We want to ensure that we're thinking about it as we know that this is a child who's a dialect speaker who also has a language disorder, right? So I think, and I talk about this with both students as well as the people who are working with them as ways to leverage their linguistic power. So I'm going to get to your question in these next few slides. So we know that there are links between poverty and oral language ability, spoken linguistic variation like dialect use. It's important for us to explore how we can not only use, but increase the linguistic power of AAE speakers to be able to provide these reading outcomes. And so these linguistic differences have to be viewed positively. We can't have these negative assumptions. We have to use these linguistic differences as a launching pad to then teach target skills, right? And so many speakers of AAE are considered bidialectal. I consider myself to be bidialectal because I can use AAE, I can use Southern White English. I'm from South Carolina originally, right? There's overlap between the two. I can also use academic English, right? This is linguistic flexibility. It is amazing. And I talk about this with the students that I've worked with as I'm helping they have superpowers. I am helping them to increase their linguistic superpowers. Look at all the amazing things you can do with language, right? Think about what happens in rap music. That's essentially poetry, right? We can look at what's happening, what children have to do when they are holding multiple dialects, or you can insert multiple languages when they're looking at these things within their heads, when they're trying to determine how to respond. It's important that we are showing them that this is amazing. You have a superpower. You're able to go back and forth, change the way you said it, say it in a different way, say it to other people in a whole nother way, right? And it's completely impactful. When children then start to believe that what they are bringing to the table is important. My goal as a reading researcher and as an SLP, I want people to get just as excited about when you hear of this person who's multilingual, who speaks like 5 languages, or a person who's bilingual. I want you to get just that excited about this Black child who is an AAE speaker, who's bidialectal. It is an amazing superpower to be able to have that flexibility in language. And when we start to think about it from that way, we work with students much differently. And so explicitly teaching some of these oral language skills, such as grammar, vocabulary, text structure knowledge, comprehension monitoring, all of these things have been shown to positively impact measures of language and reading in reading comprehension through in 1st through 3rd graders. I think I skipped over this part, but I want to make sure you see this on the slides. 60% of the variance in reading comprehension is explained by language skills by 3rd grade. It ain't explained by dialect. It is language skills. That means we have to target oral language. And so I always come at it from this way because I'm an SLP. How do these oral language skills directly map on or align with the reading skills? You'll see these here, right? Phonology, of course, is directly related to the alphabetic principle, letter sound knowledge, right? Phonological awareness and decoding, sound awareness activities. Semantics, clearly that's directly aligned to vocabulary and comprehension. So when we see students struggling in some of these areas that are specific to reading, right? Like decoding, what are we then going to do? Go back to the language side of it, not just focus on, we go in and we use some of these language infused reading instructional practices, right? And these are all coming from an article that I wrote with Dr. Gatlin in IDA Perspectives, the Language and Literacy Perspectives Journal. And so also you'll see here morphology and syntax. So you'll see just kind of some of those differences. But the other part, like I said, it is important when thinking about what are you doing and how are you being respectful around honoring language. The first thing is you have to empower students to believe that their language and allow them to know that when you respect their languages, their dialects and what they're bringing, you're learning about it, but then also helping to teach them about it. Teaching them that, hey, you said it this way, but you could also say it this way, right? When they are empowered and see that there are all of these differences, right? That there are all of these differences, it can be so impactful because they are learning that there are all these different ways of speaking and writing. And well, what I will say, there's a comment in the chat around, should you teach possessive nouns? It makes the kids mad. I am never trying to change anything in your oral speech, right? Because African-American English is inherently an oral dialect, right? What we are seeing, what I'm teaching is in written language because that's how you're being graded and scored when it comes to assessments and benchmark measures in schools. So Julie, should you teach possessive nouns when it comes to writing? Yes. Right? Because you're until we can dismantle the educational system to where, because I mean, we have this standardized language ideology, right? That we have to do this thing in this way, right? But are they doing things within their speech that already notates that the thing belongs to a certain person without that apostrophe S on it in their oral speech? Then no, I'm not going to go back and forth with you that you have to use it in your oral speech. But around writing, yes, because unfortunately, that's how they're graded right now. And that's how they're assessed. So I'm adding this in as something that is only going to add to your toolbox. You're never taking away from what's happening within their linguistic systems. You are simply adding to it. And in some of these types of strategies around how do you increase bidialectalism, some of these strategies, things like this, you can utilize interactions that explicitly draw students' attention to how language can vary. And so contrastive analysis is one way of doing this. You'll see some examples here, but you also want to think about this. I would say you're not just going to ask them to do it in a way that is just in expressive language, right? Have them also do it when you're thinking about possessives using some contrastive analysis, using some things to where they see, and also doing things to where we're going from AAE to MAE, some transformation, but we're also going from MAE to AAE, right? Because we should be showing that it's a two-way street, right? It goes back and forth. It goes back and forth. There's a question about, do I use the phrase mainstream American English with students? No, I usually use academic language. Like, this is what we got to do at school, or school language. We often talk about, in some of the previous work, we've talked about whether or not it's, when I'm thinking some of the, like in some of those tasks, like, oh, let's do this like in a book you'd read at school, right? But even now, sometimes I don't really like that as I've grown and progressed as a researcher, because in this same article, Johnson Gatlin 2020, we have a list of books by age. I think there's a table in the appendices that has children's books that feature both African-American English and mainstream American English. So both are in the same book. So children can see that there is this back and forth, and it's beautiful. It is this work of having that linguistic flexibility. And so when they start to see that this is something that's important and valuable, they take more ownership of it. I feel that article is in the references, yes. And if you reach out, I can definitely share the PDF to the article for anyone who's interested in giving it a read, because I think otherwise you have to be an IDA member. When thinking about all of these things, how are we also then being culturally responsive? So it goes back to that same question, right? Like, how do we do these things in a way that is additive, it's adding value, it is not negative, where they feel less than, and that the way I came to school talking is not the way that things are going. It doesn't have to be that way. Research has shown that there's a decline in AAE usage in the first few years of schools anyway, without you doing anything, right? And that's simply because they're just around different communities. You're starting to hear more of that school language or academic language. So we also know that your cultural responsiveness is really this product of all of your past experiences. And so, and yes, it is always a concern that how are we ensuring students get what they need in school, but also ensuring that when they get out into this world that constantly provides examples of how what they have, who they are, aren't valuable, that it's broken, it's wrong, that they won't find success in college and in the workforce, right? I think that a part of that, and there are some other amazing colleagues, April Baker-Bill, Jamila Elias Scott, who are doing amazing work of how you build capacity in students. For those of you, I think there were a few people who mentioned in the chat about working specifically in all Black schools. April Baker-Bill's book called, I think, Linguistic Justice, she details how over the course of a school year, she taught her students about AAE, specifically to empower them to love the dialect system that they're bringing to the table, while also giving them what they need to then be quote unquote successful, right? When they go off into college. Because the other part of this is all the things we're talking about, these are things that are helpful and great strategies for any kid, right? Every kid could have benefit from increased linguistic awareness. And so another part of this within these systems is we have to move from just that concept of cultural competency. Cultural competency in and of itself, competent means there's an endpoint, right? It means I got there, I got it, I know everything. That's not the case. We think about it as cultural humility. This was first developed in about inequities in the healthcare field. It's now starting to come over to education and public health and social work. But cultural humility, we go beyond just gaining that cultural knowledge. We have to then increase our self-awareness, because when we're more self-aware, then we treat our students differently in terms of the expectations that we put on them and the assumptions of what they can do. And we allow them to develop that self-awareness around their language systems, but then we also hold systems accountable. And that's a part of what happens, Julie, around how do we then, what are the systemic changes that will need to happen? But also, what are the power imbalances? I always tell my students around, I teach a class on, and have some sections around sociolinguistics, and the connections between culture and power and language, right? There is a reason why we are the way we are in the United States. That the scope of that doesn't go into this presentation, but it's important to know that we didn't just get here by happenstance, right? And so it's really important for us as professionals to unlearn a lot of those things. And cultural humility is one of those ways, creating this culturally responsive environment. Gloria Latson Billings, she just has a newer book that came out earlier in 2022 on these characteristics of culturally responsive teaching. And using positive perspectives on both parents and families, constantly having a higher expectation and the communications of this high expectation, but also learning within the context of culture, right? What does this mean for, and this shouldn't just say SLPs, it should say all practitioners. Bidialectalism is not a risk in need of being remedied. Being an African American English speaker is not a risk that needs to be remedied. They have these unique language experiences that may have different implications for what you do, but it does not mean that they can't learn to read and that they can't be successful readers and they can't have overall success, right? These strategies can be used with all children. So what do you do next? Increase awareness of these dialect forms and native languages used by the students in front of you. You don't make assumptions about abilities, of course. Use those scoring modifications and alternative assessments when you can. Lots of assessments in our SLP world have started to create appendices that are that provide you with scoring modifications for students who may be from dialect background, non-mainstream dialect backgrounds, or students who may be from who may be English language learners or dual language learners. Use those modifications, right? Consider background knowledge when having these assessments around vocabulary and reading comprehension, right? An easy start point, I run a website, Maya's Book Nook. An easy start point is thinking about the materials that you use. I always say, and it's not just books. Books is like a gateway because you can use books for everything, but when you become more aware, you do this for everything, right? And then you, of course, continue professional development, do all the things that you're doing. How do you do this as a reading researcher? I'm the director of the Village here at the Florida Center for Reading Research, which is our community engagement and outreach division. And we work specifically and strategically, not just with our school district, but also with community organizations and partners and stakeholders who are specifically interested in language outcomes for children. And we tie that into everything that we do. We create and support and sustain these research practice partnerships because it's also important to know that these partnerships and experiences have to be authentic, and they have to be longstanding, right? And all of these things are to support reading achievement, support children with disabilities, and to support school readiness for vulnerable populations. So if you have never been to the Florida Center for Reading Research's website, I ask that you can definitely take a look, go to the Village page. You'll see a lot of the work that we're doing, but you'll also see some amazing resources that can not only be used for you as a practitioner. You can go to the For Educator side of the page. There's also a For Families side of the page that provides you not just with activities that you can use with your children at home that are evidence-based, but you can also watch videos on YouTube. Like literally at the beginning of the pandemic, this is my daughter and I, we made like 2-3 minute videos to empower parents in different types of, in diverse families. There are some older siblings doing these high quality language and literacy activities. We've put resources in each and every school in our school district, completely specific to the age, of the kids within that school, with materials, things that families can take home that we restock all the time. I personally run this website that focuses on how do you create and promote strong language and literacy foundations. And one of the best ways is through children's books. I absolutely love them. And so I use, when thinking about this, I use this acronym MUST to be able to talk about how to choose a book to read when you're working with students. When you're still doing shared read alouds, and even when students are independent readers, you're still doing shared read alouds to get at all of those language skills, right? So it must be multicultural. You have unique vocabulary and sophisticated language. It has to have a story grammar component. Should be 10 minutes or less, or if you are going to do it, you can't spend the whole time reading the book because you can keep this same book over and over. But we use this stuff to be able to show families and even practitioners that there are so many different ways that you can use books to target all of these different areas, from semantics to pragmatics to emergent literacy. I create these beyond the book guides that are specifically, our first target audience was for families to be able, and you can click the hyperlink, it'll take you to a larger version. These Beyond the Book guides are completely free on my website that gives a summary of the book, things to do before, during, and after reading, as well as targeted tier 2 vocabulary. They are designed for both practitioners and families. We have literally mailed these with books to families over the summer as a pivot to some of our research work that's been happening, but to empower families, because we also know that the more you read, it's not just having access to books, it's what you do with the book. And so we have dialogic reading questions, all the stuff that's there. These are on my website, but we're also kicking off an amazing project with our public library system, to where we're creating these book nook bundles that will then appear on the website, to where people who aren't in Tallahassee can create a similar kind of a thing, where families will be able to check out a book nook bundle from the library that includes a book guide like this, as well as it includes a book guide, as well as the diverse book and activity guide, a student center activity, some kind of language and literacy activity, as well as some kind of extension game or arts and crafts kind of a thing that they can keep going. There were a few people who asked what the website is. It is linked within this, and if Jeannie or Jenny could put it in the chat for me as I close out, because I want to make sure I have some time for your questions. Gaining cultural humility, using these culturally responsive practices when thinking about our students who are from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. This is a continuous process. It includes developing cultural awareness, and that is dynamic. We have to also discontinue our assumptions that there is something inherently wrong with students from vulnerable populations. David Kirkland wrote a short op-ed around the assumptions that we make about vulnerable learners is that there's something wrong with them. And I'm just reading this it's from a 2019 article from David Kirkland. When we assume something is wrong with the student, we seek to change the student rather than change the system that's around him or her or them. The logic here is that students should learn the way we teach rather than us teach students the way they learn, right? So rather than us teach the way our students learn. Assumption then becomes our framework for how we do all the things: teaching, interpreting others, understanding our surroundings, and even making sense of this social existence. And so we have to discontinue the thought that there is something wrong with these students. We have to change and then show that we're valuing, and not only valuing, but leveraging those differences that they bring to the table, utilize those culturally responsive practices, and then, of course, stick with what the evidence says around the science of reading. Hopefully, then we will see those gains. Our final slide is just a quote from Kofi Annan. Literacy is a bridge from misery to hope. It is a tool for daily life in a modern society. It is a bulwark against poverty, and a building block. For everyone, everywhere, literacy is, along with education in general, a basic human right. Literacy is finally the road to which human progress and the means through which every man, woman, and child can realize his or her full potential. We don't have a standard or we don't have an official language in the US, but MAE, or academic language, is looked at as the standard. We have this standardized language ideology. It is important, and I hope that your takeaway today is that all languages have value, all dialects have value. None should be stigmatized as broken or less than. When we reframe the way we think about dialects and bilingualism, we can empower our students. We have to work actively to make them equal, to understand them, and to understand the history around how we got to where we are in order to help our children of color. Thank you all for all of your questions, your engagement. I'm excited to get to the last bit of questions that are in the chat.
Thanks, Dr. Johnson. We've got